A widow defended her ranch alone, until the man meant to end it, chose to stand beside her. The prairie was cracked wide open dry as a preacher's throat and just as unforgiving. Wind scraped over the empty cattle pens like it meant to take skin. Everything about the land felt brittle, resentful, watchful, and ready to snap. Josephine McAllister stood alone beside the dry well hands gripped white around the pump handle. She pressed down once. Nothing. Again. Still nothing. Her jaw locked, but she didn't curse, didn't cry. She just stared at the dust where water used to be and whispered, "Not today." The sun was already burning when she reached for the last feed sack. 2 kids waited in the shade, too quiet for their age. Behind them, the ranch house leaned like it knew it wouldn't last the season. But Jo didn't flinch. Not when she saw the letter tacked to her door. Not when she read it twice. Final notice, 5 days, signed by a name she'd hoped was dead. She folded it once, tucked it into her waistband, and walked back to the barn where her late husband's rifle still waited above the doorway. A dust cloud rose on the southern horizon. Not a storm, a rider, and maybe this time he wouldn't be alone. The wind had been singing a funeral song across the Texas high plains for months now, a parched lament of decay and ruin. But nothing cut deeper than hearing that song through the desperate, rattling moans of starving cattle, each lowing cry a fresh stab into Josephine's heart, a wound far more cruel than the bullet that had stolen Samuel from her. This land, once a promise, was now a relentless test, stripping away everything but the rawest will to survive. The Texas high plains stretched out like an old cracking hide, scorched and parched beneath a merciless sun. It was 1878, and a relentless drought had transformed what were once vibrant green pastures into vast desiccated swathes of golden brittle earth. The ground itself was a patchwork of deep fissures, each crack a testament to the land's thirst so parched that every step kicked up a cloud of angry red dust, stinging the eyes and blurring the horizon. The McAllister homestead, a modest spread that had once hummed with the quiet promise of a good life, now stood as a stark monument to enduring hardship. The lean-to barn sagged like an old man's shoulders, its timbers groaning in the relentless wind. The corrals, meant to hold a thriving herd, stood mostly empty, their fences splintered and sagging. And the well, once the very lifeline of their existence, now offered only a cracked, muddy basin, a cruel mockery of the water it once held. The cattle, a handful of bony, sun-baked creatures, were their last remaining asset, standing motionless, their ribs stark against their flanks. Each breath they took seemed a monumental effort, a desperate struggle against an unseen enemy. Josephine Samuel McAllister's widow was as much a part of this land as the gnarled mesquite trees that dotted the landscape, tough, weathered, and possessing an unyielding core of resilience. At 30, she should have been in the prime of her strength and hope, yet every day was a battle for her fought alone. Her hair, once a lustrous auburn, was now dry and brittle-streaked with premature gray from the ceaseless sun and gnawing worry. Her eyes, a striking blue-gray, should have held a soft tenderness, but now they bore a weary yet fiercely determined gaze accustomed to scanning the vast empty distances. This young widow, left to her own devices, was raising 2 small children, Eli a lean, sharp-witted 7-year-old whose eyes held an old soul's apprehension, and June a spirited 4-year-old whose innocent laughter still managed to echo faintly across the desolate yard, a defiant splash of joy amidst the pervasive harshness. Josephine clung to this homestead not merely for sustenance, but for a sacred vow etched deep within her very being. Sam had whispered it, his voice fading with his last breath, that this land was all they had, the very future of their children. "Hold on to it, Jo." He had rasped his fingers weakly, clutching hers, "with your blood and bone." Then came the hammering. A single nail driven deep into the porch post sometime between her fence work and the noonday water break. She hadn't heard it, hadn't seen the hammer, only the envelope. Its paper was fresh, ink sharp. It smelled of tobacco and sweat and an office far from the sun. She tore it open with her thumb. Final notice. The McAllister estate remains unpaid. You are hereby granted 5 days to surrender property and vacate. Failure to comply will result in direct enforcement action. Consider this a final offer of dignity. Signed, Hank Tolliver, landowner, Southwest Holdings. She read it once, then again. Her hand didn't shake, but her mouth went dry. The paper crinkled as she folded it. Not with fear, not yet, with something closer to fatigue. That night, Jo sat on the front porch, the rifle across her knees, one eye on the well, the other on the stars. The kids were asleep. The cows were still. But the land trembled beneath her, not like an earthquake, but like a held breath. She opened Sam's old locket, thumbed the tiny portrait inside. His smile, frozen in better times, felt like a stranger now. But she held it just the same. "I haven't left," she whispered, "but I ain't whole either." Samuel's vow echoed in her mind, a sacred promise that would not be broken. She could still recall the acrid smell of gunpowder, his pained gasp, and the chilling cold as life ebbed from the man she had loved more than life itself. That grief remained a raw, unhealed wound, a constant ache beneath her stern composure. The crushing weight of the ranch's upkeep, the ceaseless worry for her 2 young ones, the chilling new threat from Tolliver, all pressed down on her slender shoulders. "I cannot fall," she would whisper to herself. "I must not fall." Yet there were moments when the sheer exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her, when she longed to simply collapse and let the unforgiving desert claim her. But then, as if by some invisible hand, her gaze would invariably fall upon the innocent, trusting faces of Eli and June. They were her reason to persevere, the fragile, flickering light in the gathering darkness. She would not let them become doggies, which are orphaned calves in this cruel, indifferent world. That late afternoon, as Josephine coaxed the last of her scrawny cattle back into the rickety corral, each slow, shuffling step raising a fresh cloud of red dust, she felt a distinct, unsettling prickle on the back of her neck, an awareness of being watched. She paused slowly, turning her head, her hand unconsciously tightening on the worn leather of her skirt. From a distant ridge outlined starkly against the bruised canvas of the fading sky, a lone rider sat silhouetted. The man with a wide-brimmed hat, pulled low, obscuring his face, sat motionless as a statue, a formidable, unreadable presence. Josephine felt a chill run down her spine, a prickle of unease. This was not one of Tolliver's men. Those swaggering brutes were always louder, more ostentatious. This man was different, silent, enigmatic, a quiet observer. She knew instinctively that he was studying her, assessing the scene before him. He did not intervene. Not yet. He simply sat there, a phantom of the wild frontier, waiting. Josephine's heart began to beat a little faster, a mixture of trepidation and a strange, desperate curiosity. Was he another threat or an unwanted, unpredictable intervention? Whatever he was, his silent arrival had shattered her fragile solitude, a potent harbinger that something profound was about to unfold on this parched, desperate land. Her battle, once hers alone, might no longer be so. The silence that followed the stranger's vanishing act from the ridge was heavier than the dust that clung to every surface of the homestead. Josephine had half expected him to be another phantom of the plains, a fleeting shadow cast by the brutal sun. Yet a peculiar unease lingered. She'd finished her evening chores, her movements stiff and automatic, but her mind kept replaying the image of that unmoving silhouette, stark against the fading light. It was only as dusk deepened, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and angry orange, that he reappeared riding back into the yard with his horse's hooves stirring barely a whisper from the parched earth. Miguel Reyes. That was the name he carried, though he didn't offer it freely, nor did he introduce himself. He dismounted with a fluid grace that belied the subtle weariness etched on his face, the saddle leather creaking faintly in the twilight. His shoulders were broad, his frame lean and hardened by years. On the trail, a stark contrast to the hollow-cheeked men Josephine had grown accustomed to seeing. He wore a dust-stained duster coat that seemed to swallow the dimming light, and his eyes, when they finally met hers, were dark and unreadable, like distant storm clouds gathering on the horizon. He was a reformed gunslinger by the tale's craving anonymity, haunted by the ghosts of his past. "Tolliver sent me." He set his voice low and even devoid of the usual bluster or threats Josephine expected from men of his ilk. He didn't raise his voice over the rising wind, a stark difference from the hot-as-a-$2 pistol thugs she'd encountered before. Josephine stood hands on her hips, a thin line of defiance in her posture. She watched him, her blue-gray eyes unflinching, reflecting the last sliver of twilight. She was bone-deep tired, a weariness that had long ago surpassed fear. She'd heard all the threats faced down enough hardships to strip most folks bare. This man with his quiet presence was just another obstacle in a long line of them. "If you've come to take this land," she replied, her voice raspy from the dust and disuse, "then do it quickly. I still have milk to get for my children." Reyes didn't move his gaze, unwavering. He simply stood there, absorbing her words, the quiet desperation beneath the defiance. He'd seen plenty of fight in men, but this was different. This was a woman pushed to the very brink, beyond fear, beyond hope, left with nothing but raw, stubborn will. He glanced around the desolate yard, the starved cattle, the splintered fences, the dry well. The wind picked up whipping dust around them, making the air taste of grit and hopelessness. He'd been sent to repossess the land to serve as Tolliver's intimidating presence, but looking at her, seeing her pragmatic, quietly defiant stance, something shifted within him. He remembered another ranch, another family brutally displaced. "There's a storm coming," Reyes said finally, his eyes scanning the horizon, not a hint of the usual bravado. His words were a simple observation, but they carried a weight, a quiet warning. The sky, which had been a clear, relentless blue for months, was indeed darkening to the west, an ominous bruised purple spreading rapidly. Josephine scoffed, a dry, humorless sound. "A storm. We haven't seen a decent drop of rain in a year. Don't waste my time with fairy tales, mister." She turned, heading towards the sagging barn, her silhouette stark against the fading light. "If you're going to take what's left, then get to it. I have no fight left for fancy words." But Reyes didn't follow immediately. He watched her, a knot forming in his gut. The wind began to howl, a different kind of song now, a rising shriek that tore at the loose timbers of the barn. Dust swirled into blinding cyclones. The first fat drops of rain, surprisingly cold, splattered against his duster, kicking up puffs of dry earth. "It's a gully washer," he called out, his voice cutting through the sudden roar of the wind. "You won't make it to town tonight." Josephine paused at the barn door, turning slowly. The rain was coming down harder now, a deafening drumbeat on the corrugated tin roof. She looked at the darkening sky, then back at Reyes. There was no trickery in his eyes, only a quiet certainty. The thought of riding out in such a storm with her children, of facing the sudden flash floods that could sweep away a wagon in seconds, was terrifying. She had faced the dust and the burn of shame, but the raw power of a sudden western storm was something else entirely. "All right, doe wrangler," she said, using the slang term for a camp cook, a subtle dry jab at his uninvited presence. "You can find shelter in the barn. Don't touch anything." Her tone was anything but welcoming, yet the offer was there, a begrudging acceptance of necessity. She was too loud, too wild, too much for most, as some folks used to say, but she understood survival. Reyes simply nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible tilt of his head. He led his horse into the relative shelter of the barn, the animal snorting softly as the rain began to fall in sheets. He unsaddled the mare, rubbing her down with a worn cloth, the familiar movements a small comfort in the chaos. Inside the small, sparsely furnished cabin, the air crackled with a sudden, unaccustomed warmth. Josephine had stoked the stove, the crackling fire casting dancing shadows on the worn wooden walls. Eli and June, initially wide-eyed and silent, watched Reyes with a child's unfiltered curiosity as he warmed himself by the fire. June, usually shy around strangers, toddled over her small hand, clutching a crudely carved wooden horse. She held it up to Reyes, her eyes wide. Reyes looked down at the toy, then at the little girl. A flicker of something soft, something akin to recognition, passed through his dark eyes. He knelt, taking the wooden horse gently. "Nice carving," he murmured, his voice surprisingly gentle for a man of his hardened demeanor. Eli, watching from behind his mother's skirt, seemed to relax slightly. Later, over a meager supper of beans and cornbread, the quiet hush of the storm outside filling the cabin, no one spoke much. No one asked Reyes who he was or why he was truly there. Josephine kept a wary eye on him, but the warmth of the stove, the rhythmic drumming of the rain, and the presence of another adult, however unwelcome, eased a fraction of the immense solitude she had carried for so long. She found herself subconsciously leaning into the unfamiliar sense of shared space, a subtle shift toward something more than convenience. That night, Reyes didn't ride out. He simply uncinched his saddle, a small, deliberate act of staying. He found a spot on the floor near the barn entrance, wrapped in his duster, and slept. The storm raged, lashing against the thin walls of the homestead, but inside a fragile, unspoken truce had settled. For the first time in months, Josephine felt a faint stir of something akin to hope, a quiet defiance against the bleak landscape that surrounded them. The very act of his staying, unexpected and unasked for, had changed the narrative, transforming a potential threat into a reluctant, uncertain presence. He was no longer just a shadow on the ridge. He was here on her land, under her roof, and the quiet rhythm of his breathing was now a part of the storm-swept night. The morning after the sudden torrential downpour brought an eerie calm to the McAllister homestead. The air was fresh-washed clean of dust, carrying the damp scent of revived earth. But the temporary peace was deceptive, for the real storm, the one brewed by Tolliver, was still on the horizon. Josephine found Reyes already awake, tending to his horse, his movements economical and silent, like a shadow against the pale dawn. Eli, clutching his wooden horse, watched him from the porch, a silent, curious observer. Josephine brought him a tin cup of coffee, the steam curling into the cool morning air. She still held a wariness in her posture, a tautness that betrayed her unspoken questions. Reyes accepted the cup, his fingers brushing hers briefly. "Thank you," he murmured, his gaze sweeping over the revitalized land. He saw the faint green shoots beginning to emerge, a testament to the life that stubbornly persisted. "You said Tolliver sent you," Josephine began, her voice steady, though her heart hammered a nervous beat against her ribs. "You haven't told me why you stayed." She needed answers, a shred of truth in this unpredictable wilderness. Reyes took a slow sip of coffee, the warmth spreading through him. He looked at her, his dark eyes seeming to weigh his words carefully. "I was with Shaw's gang." He stated, his voice flat, devoid of pride or shame. The name Shaw hung in the air like a pall, a name synonymous with ruthless violence on the plains. Josephine flinched, her eyes narrowing. She knew Shaw knew of the brutal stories that followed his every move, the demonic brutality of Comanche attacks on white settlers, where torture killings and gang ropes were common, though Shaw was no Comanche. "I left them," Reyes continued, his gaze drifting to the distant rising sun. "Saw them do things to families like yours, families who wouldn't move off their land." His voice grew quiet, laced with a barely perceptible tremor of regret that spurs redemption. "I saw what it did. I couldn't stomach it anymore." He didn't offer details, but the unspoken horror filled the space between them. He had witnessed the kind of violence that shattered trust and haunted his conscience. Josephine's breath caught in her throat. Her hands clenched into fists, the warmth of the coffee cup forgotten. Anger, hot and fierce, surged through her, mingling with a chilling understanding. "So, you're a killer with a conscience, then?" She spat, her voice laced with bitterness. "A man who watched innocent people die, then decided he'd had enough." She took a step closer, her eyes blazing. "If you ever pointed a gun at a mother, then don't you dare take another step towards me." Her words were clipped, her anger raw. Reyes met her gaze unflinching. "I left," he repeated, his voice firm, "because of what I saw, not for glory or for any man's forgiveness, for my own." He understood her fury, the dignity amid discrimination she held even in her anger. Their tense exchange was abruptly cut short by the sound of hoofbeats approaching the homestead. Not Shaw's large band, but a single rider. An unpleasant-looking man Josephine recognized as one of Tolliver's foremen. He reined in his horse, a sneer on his face. "5 days, McAllister," the foreman barked, ignoring Reyes. "Tolliver says 5 days. Then he sends his clean-up crew. You hear me, woman? Pack your bags, or get ready for a messy end." He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the freshly dampened earth before turning his horse and riding off. The words hung in the air, a chilling countdown. Josephine's heart sank, the last vestiges of hope threatening to abandon her. 5 days. She looked at the barren fields, then at her children playing near the barn, oblivious. It was an unbearable choice. Reyes, his face grim, stepped forward. "I know how Shaw works," he said, his voice low, urgent. "I know how to defend this place. We can fight them." He outlined a crude defense plan using the terrain, the existing fences, his knowledge of their tactics. Josephine stared at him, the weight of his offer crushing her. Trusting him felt like a gamble with everything she had left. But what other choice did she have? To surrender was to lose Samuel's land, her children's future. To fight, even with a reluctant bad egg, like Reyes, was at least a chance. Her hope hung like icicles, sharp, fragile, and melting fast. Finally, she nodded, a single decisive jerk of her head. "All right, stranger," she said, her voice barely a whisper, a mix of desperation and a burgeoning, terrifying courage. "Show me what you know. Not because I trust you, because I have no other choice." Her words hung in the air, a fragile pact forged out of desperation and the sheer will to survive. The days that followed Tolliver's chilling ultimatum were a blur of dust, sweat, and a quiet, desperate intensity. The McAllister homestead, once a place defined by its stillness, now hummed with a strained energy. Josephine and Reyes moved with a synchronized purpose, a silent agreement forged in the crucible of impending doom. There was no room for pleasantries, only efficiency. Reyes, with a grim determination, began preparing the ranch for a siege. He knew the land, felt its subtle contours beneath his worn boots, and understood the brutal logic of men like Shaw. He showed Eli how to set simple traps around the corrals, not to kill, but to slow down any approaching riders, to buy precious seconds. Eli, usually so timid, listened intently, his young eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination, absorbing every word from the silent man who moved like a ghost. Reyes spoke little, mostly in clipped commands or quiet observations about the wind's direction, the shifting shadows. While Reyes worked the perimeter, Josephine faced her own battle. It had been years since she'd touched a rifle, not since Samuel taught her how to handle the old Winchester. Now, under Reyes's watchful, unreadable gaze, she relearned. Her shoulders ached, her fingers blistered, and the recoil bruised her collarbone. Each shot was a jolt, a physical reminder of the violence she was preparing to embrace. She missed often, but with each attempt, the tremors in her hands lessened, the aim grew truer. She had to. Her children's lives depended on it. There was no space for self-pity, only the fierce determination to protect. Amidst the frantic preparations, small, unexpected moments of normalcy flickered like distant campfires in the vast darkness. June, oblivious to the storm brewing around them, would often toddle after Reyes, her small hand clutching a crudely carved wooden horse. Once Josephine saw June offer the toy to Reyes, and he without a word had knelt and shown the little girl how to carve a tiny saddle from a scrap of leather. Another evening, as the last light bled from the sky, Josephine found herself patching Samuel's old wedding photograph, the one torn in the chaotic move west. She smoothed the creases aligning the fractured edges, a silent act of mending not just paper, but perhaps herself. Then, a few days into their desperate preparations, the first taste of what was to come arrived. A small group of Tolliver's men, 3 hard-faced riders, appeared on the horizon, riding slowly, brazenly, a mere show of force. They circled the ranch like buzzards, their laughter carrying on the wind, clearly meant to intimidate. Josephine felt her heart pound a frantic drum against her ribs. She raised her rifle, her hands trembling, and fired. The shot went wide, kicking up dust harmlessly. But Reyes didn't miss. His movements were fluid, terrifyingly precise. 2 shots cracked almost as one. One of the riders cried out, his arm jerking back as blood bloomed on his sleeve. Another's horse reared, throwing its rider. The third, seeing the sudden, unexpected resistance, wheeled his horse and bolted. It was over in seconds. Eli, who had been watching from the doorway, gasped, his face ashen. It was the first time he had seen blood, spilled in anger, the first harsh lesson of the frontier. Josephine, too, felt a cold knot in her stomach, but it was quickly replaced by a furious surge of adrenaline. As Reyes checked on the injured man who lay groaning in the dirt, he hesitated. He didn't raise his gun for a finishing shot. He merely disarmed him, his face unreadable. Josephine, witnessing this, felt a fresh wave of fury. "What are you doing?" She snarled, her voice raw sharp with fear and frustration. "You finish what you start out here, Reyes, half measures get us all killed." Reyes stood turning slowly to face her, his gaze steady. "Killing isn't winning, Joe," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Keeping your children alive is." The words hung between them, a stark difference in their understanding of survival, a clash of his hardened pragmatism and her desperate protective rage. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues. Then, from the distant watchpost on the farthest hill, a single flare of orange light blossomed against the deepening twilight. A signal, a chilling confirmation. Shaw had arrived. The air thickened with the scent of sagebrush and the acrid tang of dust as twilight bled into a menacing night. The distant flare of light had been a stark warning, and now the low rumble of hooves growing steadily louder was the confirmation. Shaw and his full band rode in a dark tide against the last vestiges of orange in the sky. Their forms, silhouetted against the horizon, seemed monstrous, their presence a suffocating weight. Josephine stood her ground near the main house, rifle clutched tight. Her hands were steady now, the trembling replaced by a cold, resolute calm. Eli was at her side, a small, pale shadow. June huddled behind him. Reyes, a phantom in the deepening gloom, positioned himself near the corrals, his rifle already aimed, his eyes tracking the approaching riders. The silent tension that had built over days was about to shatter. "McAllister!" Shaw's voice boomed raw and guttural, carrying on the wind. "Time's up. Come out and face it." The first shots cracked, not from Shaw's men, but from Reyes, strategically targeting the lead horses, aiming to disorient, not to kill outright. Chaos erupted. Shaw's men fanned out their own guns, spitting fire, the flashes illuminating their cruel faces. Josephine returned fire, the Winchester bucking against her shoulder. She moved with a surprising agility, dropping to one knee, reloading, aiming, a woman transformed by the necessity of survival. The air filled with the deafening roar of gunfire, the sharp cries of men, and the terrified bellowing of the cattle. A stray bullet splintered the wood of the porch railing near Josephine, sending splinters flying. She pushed Eli and June further back towards the relative safety of the house. Reyes, a whirlwind of controlled violence, met Shaw's men head-on near the burning corrals. The flames, started by a stray lantern during the skirmish, now leapt and danced, casting a hellish glow on the desperate fight. It was a chaotic ballet of shadows and fire, each side fighting for their very existence. Reyes moved with a brutal efficiency as past as a gunslinger, evident in every precise shot, every swift movement. He wasn't just defending, he was reclaiming a part of himself, confronting the ghosts that had driven him to abandon Shaw. Suddenly, a heavy blow sent Josephine sprawling into the dirt. One of Shaw's men, having bypassed Reyes, loomed over her, his face a mask of rage. Pain flared in her left shoulder, a searing fire. She scrambled backward, dropping her rifle, her breath catching in her throat. Just as he raised his gun, Eli, small but fierce, darted forward. He had picked up his father's old Colt, heavy and unwieldy in his small hands. He pointed it at the man, his lower lip trembling, but his eyes wide and defiant, just like his mother's. "Leave her alone," he screamed, a child's raw courage shining through his fear. The man paused, surprised by the boy, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He hesitated, then aimed his weapon at Eli. In that critical instant, Reyes, who had just downed another of Shaw's men, saw it. The world seemed to slow. He saw Josephine wounded and vulnerable, and Eli, a mere child, standing between her and a cold-blooded killer. It was a mirror of the past he had tried to outrun, the very reason he had abandoned Shaw's path. A guttural roar tore from his throat. He aimed not at the gunman, but at Shaw himself, who was engaging Reyes's former comrades nearby. The shot was swift, precise. Shaw crumpled a dark heap, his reign of terror silenced. Reyes, who had once followed Shaw, who had called him a comrade, now delivered the killing blow. As Shaw fell, a small worn leather pouch spilled from his pocket. It bounced on the dusty ground, opening to reveal a tarnished silver locket and a folded, faded bill of sale for a tract of land. Josephine, her hand pressed to her bleeding shoulder, recognized the name scrawled at the bottom of the bill, Hank Tolliver. But beneath it, almost illegible, was another name crossed out crudely, Miguel Reyes. This was more than just a simple land grab. This was Tolliver, the corrupt authority, wiping out any trace of those he had wronged. He had not just hired Shaw. He had used him to erase his own tracks, perhaps even to eliminate Reyes himself, tying Shaw to Reyes's own brutal past. The shot Reyes fired, killing Shaw, was not just for Josephine, but a delayed, brutal justice for his own history, fulfilling a twisted vengeance that becomes emptiness, then purpose. With their leader fallen, the remaining men of Shaw's gang faltered, their brutal resolve crumbling. Some fled into the night, their horses scattering. Others, injured and disoriented, simply dropped their weapons. The immediate threat was gone, but another loomed. The fires in the corrals, left unchecked, were now spreading, licking at the dry grass, threatening to engulf the entire homestead. Reyes, his face streaked with sweat and soot, knelt beside Josephine. His eyes, though still guarded, held a fierce, urgent light. He tore a strip from his own leather wrist binding, a constant companion, a symbolic item from his past, and quickly, expertly tied it around her bleeding shoulder, a makeshift tourniquet. "Hold tight," he rasped, his touch firm. Then, without waiting for a reply, he was on his feet, shouting commands to Eli, directing him to help herd the panicked cattle away from the encroaching flames. The battle for the land was over. The battle to save what was on it had just begun. Just as the last vestiges of Shaw's gang vanished into the night and the flames from the corrals threatened to engulf the entire homestead, the heavens opened. It wasn't the scattered drops of days past, but a biblical deluge, a pounding, cleansing downpour that instantly began to douse the burgeoning inferno. The rain, a true gully washer, hammered the parched earth, turning dust to mud, washing away the scent of gunpowder and the lingering echoes of screams. It was a deluge that felt both miraculous and earned, scrubbing the land clean of the night's violence. The McAllister homestead, though scarred, stood. The house was untouched, the barn singed but salvable, and Reyes, soaked to the bone, had managed to save the panicked cattle, herding them to higher ground just in time. As dawn broke, painting the water-slicked world in soft new light, Josephine sat on the cabin's porch step, her shoulder throbbing faintly beneath the makeshift bandage Reyes had fashioned from his leather wrist binding. Eli, no longer pale with fear, but flushed with the thrill of survival, was splashing in a puddle near Reyes, who was patiently showing him how to skip stones across the newly formed puddles. June perched on Reyes's hip, giggled, pointing at the sky. Josephine watched them, a profound sense of peace settling over her. The isolation that had been her constant companion for so long, the crushing weight of being utterly alone, had finally lifted. She looked at Reyes no longer just a bad egg or a reformed gunslinger, but a quiet, steadfast presence who had chosen to stay. The violence of the night had forged an undeniable bond, a silent understanding between them. Weeks later, as the landscape slowly transformed from mud to tender green, a lone rider, a traveling merchant, stopped by the revived ranch. He nodded respectfully at the sturdy new fence posts and the blooming wildflowers Josephine had planted near the porch. "Heard about the trouble out here," he drawled, his eyes taking in the refreshed landscape and the thriving cattle. "Folks say you held your ground like a man. Got pretty good with that rifle, did you?" Josephine smiled, a small, genuine smile that softened the hard lines of her face. She looked past him towards where Reyes was teaching Eli to mend a saddle, their heads bent in quiet conversation. June ran giggling towards them, a bright spot of color. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong, her gaze sweeping across the land, now vibrant and alive. "I held this land because in the end I wasn't alone anymore." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The ranch, now known by some as Wildflower Ridge, not just for the blooms but for the woman who made them grow, had found its future. And as Reyes glanced over, his dark eyes meeting hers across the sun-drenched yard, a quiet, wordless promise passed between them. The West was still wild, full of hardship and uncertainty, but on this patch of land, two souls who had once walked alone had found a way to root themselves together. What they would build, what their shared future held, remained unwritten, a story waiting to unfold with each new sunrise. If this tale of grit and ghosts touched your heart, if you felt the sting of betrayal, the burden of silence, and the quiet bond between a woman holding a ranch together with calloused hands and a man who came to take it but stayed to mend it, then you're riding with the right company. Because out here in the Wild West, justice doesn't come clean. It comes earned in dust and in blood. Which moment hit deepest, when she dared him to take the land, or when he chose to hold the wire instead of the gun? Tell me down in the comments. Hit, like if their quiet war made you hold your breath and drop a comment with the line that stayed with you, like a scar under sunlight. Next time we ride into a new kind of storm where dignity meets discrimination, and a soldier's trumpet calls back louder than any bullet. What happens when the country you serve turns on you, and the only way to clear your name is to survive the ambush meant to erase you? Subscribe and ring the bell so you won't miss a single note from the next battle for truth, for honor, and for the voices buried too long in silence.